Montana Territory, August 1877. The wind carried dust and the smell of dry pine when Florence Granger stepped off the stagecoach in Red Elk Crossing, her boots hitting cracked earth like she had nowhere else left to go, and she did not. Her black skirts hung heavy with road dust. One gloved hand rested over the curve of her belly, just beginning to swell under her corset. She had not yet said the words aloud, not to anyone, but they rang in her chest like a bell. I am carrying a dead man's child. The child of Thomas Hale, gunned down outside Helena 3 months ago. A man whose name she could not speak here, not when it earned her nothing but stares and whispers. A gambler, a thief, a man with enemies. He had left her with nothing but a cracked wedding band and a promise he never got to keep. "Ma'am?" A voice called from the edge of the platform. Florence turned. A man leaned against a fence post, one leg bent, arms folded. He wore a tan hat low over his eyes, the kind that had seen years of sun and storms. His shirt was sun-faded blue, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dust on his boots and belt. A rifle was slung across his back, but his hands were empty. He looked about 30, maybe a year or two older. No wedding ring, just quiet eyes the color of the Missouri River. "You Florence Granger?" he asked. She nodded, squinting. "And you are?" "Justice Vaughn," he said. "I was told you were coming. Sheriff asked me to meet the stage. He's out hunting horse thieves." Florence's throat tightened. "I do not need an escort. I just need a room." Justice didn't move from the post. "Not here on escort." "Sheriff said you might need work. I got a spread 10 miles out. Could use help." Her fingers curled tighter around the handle of her worn bag. "I am not a maid." "No one said you were," he replied easily. "But I have a garden too stubborn to grow and a barn that needs paint. You would have your own room. No one to answer to but yourself." She looked past him to the wide open land. It was flat and sun-bleached, but beyond it, the hills turned gold where the light caught them. She had nowhere else to go. No family left, no money to speak of. And no one was hiring a woman in her condition, not when the bump would soon give her away. "I will think about it," she said, stepping past him. He did not follow. Just tipped his hat. "I will be in town until morning. Ask for me at the livery." That night, in the upstairs room of Mrs. Adler's boarding house, Florence sat on the edge of a too-soft bed and stared at the moonlit ceiling. Her hand rested over her belly again. "I am not doing this for me," she whispered. "I am doing it for you." She thought about Thomas's last letter, crumpled, ink-smudged, and full of dreams he never got to make real. She would not raise his child on charity. She would not beg. The next morning, she found Justice Vaughn at the livery cleaning a saddle. "I will take the job," she said. He looked up, squinting under his hat. "Good." They rode out that afternoon. She rode side saddle on a gray mare named Junie, while Justice kept pace beside her on a chestnut gelding. The ride was quiet. He did not ask about the baby, and she did not offer. His ranch, if one could call it that, was tucked between two ridges. A small house with blue shutters, a barn that leaned a little too far east, and a field that had more weeds than corn. But it was clean. And it was quiet. Inside, she found a small room with a single bed, a window that looked east, and a patchwork quilt folded at the footboard. On the dresser, someone had left a clay vase with wild sunflowers. "You did not have to do that," she said softly, running her finger along the petals. Justice stood in the doorway. "Figured everyone deserves something bright." She turned to him. "You are not what I expected." He shrugged. "Neither are you." They worked side by side for weeks. Florence cleaned the smokehouse, planted late summer squash, patched curtains. Justice rebuilt the chicken coop, repaired the roof, and taught her how to handle the stubborn mule named Betsy. He did not ask her questions. And she grew to like him for that. But it was one night in late September, when the air turned sharp and the light turned gold, that everything shifted. They were sitting on the porch after supper. She had stripped off her gloves and let her hands rest in her lap. He was whittling something, a bird. Maybe his knife slicing smooth curls from cedar. "You are quiet tonight," he said. She watched the horizon. The baby kicked for the first time this morning. His hand paused mid-carve. "That's so?" She nodded slowly. "I do not know what I am doing. I do not know how to be alone in this." Justice set the knife down. You are not alone. Not here. Her eyes found his in the fading light. He looked nervous then, like he was choosing his words careful. I do not mean to be forward, but I have been thinking. She waited. You need a name, he said. For the baby. For the world. People will talk, and you should not have to carry that weight without help. Her heart thudded. I could offer you marriage, he said. Not for love. Not unless that comes. But for safety. For your child. For a life. Florence stared at him, stunned by the honesty, the steadiness of his voice. And what would you get? She asked. He gave the smallest smile. Someone to talk to on cold nights. Someone to remind me what laughter sounds like. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. From something else. Hope, maybe. I do not expect an answer tonight, he said, picking up his knife again. But the offer stands. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind. Her fingers drifted over her belly. She thought about the empty future she had faced 2 months ago, and the quiet, steady man who had offered her something else. The next morning, she found him in the barn, feeding the horses. I will marry you, Justice Vaughn. He turned, his eyes searching hers. But not for safety, she added, stepping close, her voice steady. I think I might already be falling in love with you. He dropped the feed scoop and kissed her before he could stop himself, his hand cupping her cheek. His mouth warm and sure. She melted into him like she had been waiting her whole life. Florence smiled against his lips. I suppose this is what a deal that saves us both looks like, she whispered. Justice touched his forehead to hers. Feels like the beginning of something, right? The morning they wed was dry and bright, sunlight pooling in the cracks between the porch boards. Justice stood beside Florence under the cottonwood tree behind the house, where the wind stirred the branches just enough to make them whisper. Pastor Ellis came from the mission outpost 5 miles south, and brought with him a small wooden cross and the scent of pipe smoke clinging to his coat. Florence wore a pale blue dress she'd sewn from old calico bolts Justice found boxed in the attic. She'd let her hair down for the first time in weeks, and it fell in soft waves over her shoulders, the ends brushing the curve of her back. Her belly showed now, just enough to make her movements careful, but she stood straight, chin level, eyes steady. Justice hadn't told her he'd carved her a ring until he slipped it onto her finger. It was pine, sanded smooth and oiled with beeswax, warm from his palm. She looked at it for a long time after the pastor rode off, as if memorizing the grain. They didn't kiss in front of the preacher. But once the man's horse disappeared over the ridge, Florence turned to Justice. You didn't ask if I wanted something finer. I figured it's not finer if it don't come from my hands. She nodded once, then took his hand and laced their fingers together. You were right. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Florence washed linens in rain barrels and learned how to stretch bread dough so it didn't fall flat. Justice taught her how to brace her back when lifting the water pails, and she taught him how to mend a shirt so the patch lay flat. He'd never used a thimble before. One evening, just past dusk, Florence stood at the edge of the field, holding a lantern. Justice came up behind her, wiping sweat off his brow with his sleeve. The rows behind them were half planted in winter wheat. You ever wonder why you stayed? She asked, eyes still on the horizon. I don't wonder, he said. I know. She turned toward him. Tell me. Justice rested his hoe against the fence post and crossed his arms. I spent too long thinking I'd never build anything that lasted. My brothers scattered. My folks died before I learned how to speak decent to 'em. This land was just dirt for a while. Then you came. She didn't look away. You make it sound simple. It is. Sometimes it takes losing everything to know what's worth holding. Florence stepped closer. I don't think I'm easy to hold. I'm not looking for easy. That night, she let him touch the bare skin of her back as she undressed, his calloused fingers brushing along her spine. He moved with care, never reaching too fast, and when he kissed her shoulder, she closed her eyes, letting her ribs rise and fall beneath his hand. They did not speak much while lying together. But when the rain started tapping against the roof, she shifted closer and placed his palm over her stomach. "She's been quiet today," Florence whispered. Justice didn't move his hand. "Maybe she's listening." "To what?" He smiled faintly. "To how you breathe when you sleep. To the wind. To the sound of a house that ain't empty." In early October, a rider came up the trail with a telegram from Helena. Florence read it once, then again, her brow tightening. She folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer where she kept her sewing scissors. Justice waited until supper when she set the cornbread on the table to speak. "Trouble? My sister, the one living in Butte, took sick. They think she won't last through winter. I didn't know you had family left." "Barely do. We haven't written in years. She's asking for me." Justice chewed his bite slowly. "You want to go?" She nodded. "I need to. I owe her more than silence." He leaned back, wiping his mouth with the corner of his sleeve. "Then we'll go." Florence's hand stilled on the table. "It's a long way. We'll take it slow. I'll hitch the wagon. Pack what we need." She gazed at him. "You'd leave the land behind?" "It'll be here when we get back." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "You keep saying things I don't expect. I only say what I mean." That night, as they packed a few blankets and dried goods, Florence caught him folding the baby's first dress into her bag. It was small, cream-colored, edged with lace. She hadn't known he'd saved it. He looked up. "Figured she'd wear it first time we come back." Florence swallowed against the sudden warmth in her throat. "I think I'm glad it was you," she said. Justice didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded once and placed the dress gently beside the quilt. The wagon creaked under the weight of flour sacks, blankets, and a cedar box Florence had tucked beneath the bench. It held the last of her sister's letters, worn at the folds and stiff with age, but Florence couldn't bring herself to leave them behind, not when they might be the only welcome waiting in Butte. Justice drove with both hands tight on the reins, the road narrowing as they climbed into higher country. The horses moved steady beneath them, heads bobbing with the rhythm of the trail. Florence sat beside him, wrapped in a shawl she hadn't worn since Kansas. It still carried the faint scent of crushed lavender, long faded but not forgotten. "How long's it been since you saw her?" Justice asked without shifting his eyes from the trail. 8 years, Florence said. "She married a cattle broker. I didn't right after the baby died." Justice gave a small nod. "You don't have to explain." "I want to," she said, brushing a thumb over the fabric bunched in her lap. "When my son passed, she said it was God's will. And I told her she didn't know a thing about God or grief." Justice waited. "I packed a trunk that same day and never looked back." He glanced over. "You think she'll forgive you?" Florence looked toward the tree line, where the maples were beginning to yellow. "I'm not sure forgiveness is what either of us needs." They camped that night in a hollow half sheltered by spruce. Justice built a small fire using dry pine needles and kindling from his saddlebag. Florence watched the flames dance while she peeled an apple with her belt knife, the skin curling off in one long ribbon. She passed him a slice. "You ever been to Butte?" "Once. Drove a team of oxen through for a mining outfit. Didn't stay long. Too loud for me." He took the apple and chewed thoughtfully, then nodded toward her belly. "You have a name picked yet?" "I used to think I'd name her after my mother," she said. "But now, I'm not sure I want to tie her to anyone else's sorrow." Justice leaned back on his elbows, legs stretched toward the fire. "There's power in naming. My grandfather was Choctaw. Said names should carry where you're going, not where you've been." Florence turned that over for a while, then said, "Did you know him well?" Justice shook his head. "He died before I was born. But my father kept a clay pipe of his. Said it still smelled like river mud and hickory bark." Florence smiled faintly. "I like that." Wind moved through the trees, soft as breath. Florence pulled the shawl tighter and shifted closer to the fire. Justice rose, unrolled a second blanket from the wagon, and handed it to her without a word. The silence between them was not the kind that needed filling. It had grown companionable, sheltering, even. By the third day, the road widened and the smoke of Butte's chimneys began to streak the sky. The town had grown since Florence had last seen it, more buildings, more noise, More men with soot on their faces and pickaxes slung across their backs. They reached her sister's house just past midday. It was a narrow place on a sloped street, whitewashed with shutters painted green. A boy no older than 10 opened the door. He had her sister's eyes. "Is your mother home?" Florence asked, her voice softer than she expected. The boy nodded and disappeared inside. When Margaret appeared, her face was thinner, her hair streaked with gray. But her spine held straight, and her eyes took in Florence without blinking. "You came," Margaret said. Florence stepped forward. "You asked." They stood like that for a breath too long. Then Margaret opened the door wider. "Get in before the wind finds the cracks." Justice stayed on the porch while the sisters spoke. Florence didn't ask him to wait, he simply did. When she returned an hour later, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "She's not dying," Florence said as they walked back toward the wagon. "She's just scared. Her husband left her last spring." Justice nodded once but said nothing. Florence stopped him with a hand to his sleeve. "I told her about you." He tilted his head. "What did you say?" "That you're not the man I married to outrun the past. You're the one I stayed with because you never asked me to." Justice studied her face, the way her jaw was set, the way her eyes didn't waver. "I brought you here," he said. "But I'll follow you back too, if that's still what you want." Florence reached up, laying her palm flat against his chest. "I want to go home." He placed his hand over hers, warm and solid. "Then we'll ride by sunrise." That night, as they bedded down behind the stable, Florence pressed her forehead to Justice's and whispered the name she'd chosen. He smiled and whispered it back. And though the wind howled through the alleyways, they slept soundly, wrapped in quilt and promise, already dreaming of the life waiting beyond the hills. They left Butte before the sun crested the low ridge to the east, horses bundled in wool saddle blankets, the wagon wheels creaking under the cold weight of October frost. Florence wore one of Margaret's heavier coats, too broad in the shoulders but warm. She declined her sister's offer to stay a few days more. There was nothing left unsaid between them, and the longer she stayed, the more it would unravel. By mid-morning, they had cleared the last of the mining roads, the hills opening again into quiet pasture land. Florence kept one palm pressed against her belly, steadying herself with each jolt of the wagon axle. The baby had grown restless since they left town, feet shifting low and sure. She didn't complain. The movement reassured her more than silence ever could. Justice walked the first stretch, reins looped loosely in one hand, his hat pulled down to block the wind that had sharpened overnight. "You used to think you'd die alone?" Florence asked after a long stretch of silence. He didn't look at her, just adjusted the brim of his hat. "Didn't think about dying much. Just figured I wouldn't be missed." She studied the curve of his back, the way his shoulders bore the weight of so little said. "You ever tell anyone that?" "No." She reached forward and touched his wrist. "Tell me something else." He slowed, turned his face toward her. "I used to wish I'd been born with a different name. When I was a boy, I thought maybe I'd be braver if I'd had one that sounded harder. What changed? My father died and I realized the name didn't matter. What I did with it did." Florence let her hand fall back to her lap. "I used to wish I didn't belong to anyone." Justice's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Always felt I was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's wife. Never just myself." He stepped up onto the wagon bench and took the reins again. "You ever feel that way here?" She turned her head toward him. "Not since the day you handed me that hoe and said the weeds wouldn't pull themselves." He chuckled, a low, rough sound. Not much of a romantic gesture. It was honest. And it gave me something to put my hands on when my grief had nowhere to go. The road wound down toward a shallow creek that ran slow and clear. Justice paused the horses at the water's edge, jumped down, and walked ahead to check the depth. Florence watched the way he crouched, fingers brushing the surface. She pulled the coat tighter around her and waited until he returned. "Bottom's solid," he said. "We'll cross slow." They passed through without trouble, the water lapping at the wheels, chilled mist curling around the horses' legs. On the far side, Florence clutched the side rail and watched the way the light caught the frost on the fallen cottonwood leaves. Everything shimmered as if touched by glass. Justice cleared his throat. "There's an old trapper's cabin up ahead. Might be good to stop there tonight. I've used it before. Decent roof in a firewood left stacked behind. Florence nodded. We could use the rest. They reached it before sunset, a squat, low-beamed structure with a stone hearth and no door latch. Justice repaired it with a bit of wire and a nail from his pocket while Florence swept out the corners with a branch broom she fashioned from dry twigs. Inside, the air was musty but dry. Florence laid out the quilt, folded twice over the rough pine floorboards, and lit a stub of candle she found tucked in her sewing kit. Justice built a fire with the practiced ease of someone who had done it alone too many times. When the flames caught, he sat back on his heels. Florence placed a tin cup of warmed broth in his hand. You think we'll make it back before the snow? He took a sip, nodded. If the weather holds. If not, we'll wait it out somewhere safer. She lowered herself beside him, resting her head against the wall. I don't mind waiting if it's with you. He looked at her, then not past her, not around her, but directly into her. I never thought I'd end up with someone who saw me like you do. Not just for what I've done, but for what I might still be. Florence reached across and took his hand. I don't want safety if it costs me truth. You've given me both. He brought her hand to his lips, not as a gesture, but as a vow. They lay side by side that night on the quilt, the fire burning low. The baby shifted again, and Florence took Justice's hand and placed it where the movement was strongest. He held still, his breath slowing to match hers. What do you want most for her? He asked quietly. Florence closed her eyes. To grow up knowing what quiet love feels like. The kind that stays. She'll know, he said. Because she'll see it. And when the wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches above the roof, they stayed close, warmth shared not from need, but from choice, a promise made not in grand words, but in the hush between heartbeats. They reached the homestead as the last of the leaves dropped to the ground, brittle and gold, scuttling across the packed dirt like the season was trying to speak before winter silenced it. The field lay still, harvested clean, the stalks cut low. Justice pulled the wagon around the back and gave the horses a rub-down before leading them into the barn. Florence stood by the porch, one hand to her back, eyes on the roof line where a pair of mourning doves had nested under the eaves. Looks like the chimney held, she said as he came up beside her. I checked the flashing last snowfall, he replied. Didn't expect it to go anywhere. They unpacked in quiet motion. Florence hung the shawl near the stove, looped over a peg beside the door. Justice set the cedar box on the shelf above the hearth, not asking what she would do with it now. He didn't need to. Some things were better kept close, even if they were done. That evening, clouds drifted low, heavy with the promise of the first snow. Justice lit the lamp while Florence stirred oats into the pot, her movements slow. She paused once, her hand braced on the table's edge, her face gone still. Justice stood without asking. Tell me. She's low, Florence said, voice quiet. And steady. Might be soon. He nodded once, went to check the blankets. She gave birth 3 nights later under a waning moon that cast pale light through the east window. They didn't have a midwife, there wasn't time to fetch one, and Florence had been sure she could manage. Justice stayed near, his hand steady on her shoulder every time a wave of pain rolled through. He said little, only what needed saying, but he didn't leave her side, not once. By morning, she held a dark-haired girl against her chest, the child's breath warm and even, her fingers curled tightly around Florence's thumb. Justice sat on the floor beside the bed, his back against the wall, face drawn but calm. I named her Lark, Florence whispered. He nodded, voice hoarse. That suits her. Florence looked down at the tiny face nestled beneath the quilt. She came into the world quiet. Just opened her eyes and blinked at me like she already knew where she was. Justice leaned forward, brushing a hand gently over the child's downy head. Maybe she did. Lark slept through most of the day, waking only to root and settle again. Florence dozed beside her, the room warm from the stove and the quilt pulled high. Justice went about the chores without being asked, feeding the stock, checking the fence line, hauling water from the well. When he returned, he set a small carved figure, a lark with wings, tucked on the windowsill beside the wash basin. Florence saw it as she rose to change the baby. You made that today? He shrugged. Started it weeks ago. Finished it now that she's here. She kissed him for the first time since the birth. Slow. Sure. and with something deeper threaded through it. He kissed her back without hesitation, his hand cradling the side of her neck. "I love you," she said quietly. "I didn't know it before. I do now." He didn't blink. "I knew it the morning you handed me a pair of shears and told me the chickens wouldn't pluck themselves." She laughed, tired and full. Lark grew strong as the snow deepened. By December, she could lift her head and track the lantern light across the ceiling. Florence sang to her when the wind howled, low tunes from her childhood she hadn't remembered until the baby's breath warmed her chest. Justice built a cradle from scrap pine, sanding it smooth and lining it with wool Florence had carded herself. He never said much while he worked, but his hands moved with care, each joint fitted tight. On Christmas morning, they woke to find the world outside painted in white. The porch was drifted knee-deep, the barn roof glinting in the pale sun. Florence sat in the rocker beside the fire, Lark bundled against her chest, eyes wide and alert. Justice came in with an armful of kindling and a grin that reached his eyes. "You ever think life'd look like this?" "I didn't," she said, "but I hoped." He knelt beside her, reaching a hand toward Lark's small foot where it peeked beneath the knitted blanket. "I got something for you," he said. Florence raised a brow. "I told you not to fuss with gifts." "It wasn't fuss," he said, and stood to fetch a small envelope from the mantel. She opened it carefully. Inside was a deed, drawn up proper and notarized in Red Elk Crossing. Her name sat beside his as equal owner of the land. "Justice, I told you this was yours too," he said. "Now it's written down." She looked at the paper, then at him. "You keep giving me things I didn't think I deserved." "You were wrong," he said, and kissed her forehead. That spring, Florence planted a garden behind the house, rows of beans and cabbage and sweet corn. Justice built a fence around it to keep the mule out. Lark sat in the shade of a tied-off sheet, gumming a carved spoon and watching the wind move the tall grass. By the time the first tomatoes ripened, Florence had a new rhythm to her days, rising early, baking bread with Lark in a sling across her chest, watching Justice ride the fence line with his hat pulled low. At night, they lay together with the windows open and the baby between them, her breath a steady metronome. On the anniversary of Florence's arrival in Red Elk Crossing, they rode into town together, Lark nestled in a cradle basket between them. The townsfolk watched with quiet nods, a few tipping their hats, others offering soft greetings. Mrs. Adler handed Florence a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "For your girl," she said. "You turned out just fine." Florence thanked her, then looked to Justice. "Let's go home." They rode back through the low hills, the land greening with the promise of summer. Florence leaned against his shoulder, Lark asleep between them, the reins loose in his hand. The sky stretched wide and blue above them, and the road ahead was clear. Behind them lay grief. Beside them, love made solid. Ahead only the long, steady work of joy.